Hello and welcome. My name is Caroline and today I am answering prompt 7 of the 31 Days of Tarot 2021 challenge. And the prompt for today is the most worked with tarot decks of 2020. To answer this prompt, I used my tracking system that I showed in a previous video. It's a little notebook where each page represents a tarot card, so each card has its own page, and each time I draw this card I write down the date and the deck it comes from. So I know that precisely that the 10 tarot decks I am showing here today are exactly the 10 tarot decks I used the most in 2020. So first of all, I need to say that I do have quite an extensive tarot deck collection. One of the things I enjoy doing when I read tarot is using a new deck each time. I like to be surprised by the illustration. I know that some people really enjoy having one tarot deck that they use all the time and they know it by heart and they feel a very deep connection with the deck, and I totally understand that, but the way I function is different. I like to be challenged by a new illustration each time I read a tarot card. So I do have quite a number of tarot decks and I rotate through my collection quite a lot. So even though those are the 10 tarot decks I used the most in 2020, I did use many more decks than that, much more than 10 decks. But these are the 10 tarot decks that I use the most. So I will start by those 3 that are the least used ex aequo. So let me put this aside a little bit. So these 3 are at the bottom of my list, and they have in common that I only use them for myself, for reading for myself. This here is Mermaid Tarot by Dame Darcy. It's a deck that I have had for a long time. It's a mix of the first and the second edition of this deck, because the first and second edition had the same cardstock and same format, but a few of the cards were changed between the first and second edition. And what I did is I chose the cards I preferred in the first edition and the card I preferred in the second edition, and I mixed them together. Customized deck, I would say. Now, these 2 decks are 2 Baba Studio decks, and this one is the Bohemian Gothic Tarot, which is a deck that I have had for over 10 years now. Every year it is up in the list of my most used tarot decks. It's a favorite of mine. And this one here is the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot, also by Baba Studio. And this one precisely, this deck is the first edition. And lately, at the end of 2020, in the fall, Baba Studio released the second edition of this deck, which I also have. But the fact is I used the first edition more than the second edition this year. So those 2 decks this year in 2020, it's not true. I did use this one for a reading for a querent. But mostly those 2 decks I used for myself. So this one here is the Gorgon Tarot by Dolores Fitchie. It's a round deck, mostly black and white. not entirely black and white. There is a splash of red in 2 cards, but it's mostly black and white. And I aged it in red. And it has recently been released in a smaller version. This is the smaller version, so believe it or not, it was the original edition is much larger than that, and it's so large, the original edition, that it makes it difficult to use in spreads with more than 3 cards, because the cards are really huge. So I like this smaller edition, but nevertheless, this deck I've been using mostly for querents. It has been chosen by querents for readings, and I really enjoyed this deck a lot. I like the vibe of the deck. It's a rider-waite style deck, and very rider-waite in the style. I mean, not in the style, but in the illustrations depicted. It's very rider-waite. You can very easily recognize the original designs of the rider-waite system, but this deck mostly have female characters depicted, and it does not bother me at all, because even though it's mostly female represented, it doesn't bother me, because the vibe of the deck is not overly feminine. It's very balanced. It's how can I say that? I usually I'm not a fan of decks with only female characters or only male character, because I really like a good balance between yin and yang. And even though this deck has a vast majority of female character represented, it does not impact the good balance between yin and yang in this deck. So it doesn't bother me at all. As it's a round deck, I made it a custom little bag with a round bottom, and I used an old discarded shirt of my husband that had a hole in it, so I mended the hole and I used the fabric to make a little pouch. And this one I sewed entirely by hand, which is unusual, because I usually use a sewing machine, but for this one I entirely sewed by hand, and it took me much longer, but it was a nice process. Next is the Bohemian Cats tahoe by Baba Studio, that I used both for myself and for querents. It has been chosen several times this year by querents. Usually Baba Studios are among my favorite decks anyway, so they usually star amongst the most used deck of any said year. But this one, this year, I mean last year's, was even more used than the others, because it has been chosen several times by querents. So this is a beautiful deck. The characters are all cats dressed in Baroque or Victorian dresses, and the creators of this deck designed all the dresses and made all the dresses of the cats in a small scale, puppet size, and then they photographed the cats, and Photoshop technology, they put the dresses on the cat through Photoshop. Of course, no cat was made to wear a dress in real life. Of course not. So this little deck actually gives very precise reading, and during the year I was able to address some very specific question for querents with this deck, and at least one of the reading I made with this deck last year was quite a hard one, on a very painful subject. And even though the deck is quite quirky, it was able to address the subject very very well and with much details, and it gave a very beautiful and deep reading. So this is the Baroque Bohemian Cat tarot. Now, this one here is the Spolia tarot. So this deck also has been chosen by querents last year. And okay, I will just let the images speak for themselves because it's so beautiful. It's also a very rider-waite style deck, but it has a lot of symbolism in it that is not necessarily the same symbolism that you find in the original rider-waite. The symbols are different, but it's very heavy in symbolism, and it gives very deep readings, and it's very easy to read. I find it very easy to read with. Okay, Spolia tarot. Now, this one, I need to give it a little pouch. This one is called the Red Deck by Tarot by 7. It's a deck that has keywords, and I'm usually not a fan of keywords at all, but in this case they don't bother me because they are very discreet. I don't know if you can see them. Some of them are written here, and some of them are written reversed. So if you use reversed cards, you can the keywords appear one way or the other, and of course it's not the same keyword if you read upward or reversed. Anyway, the keywords don't bother me because they are very discreet. And Tarot by 7 offers different backings for their decks, so you can choose the backing you want for your decks. And I have this backing that I think goes very well with the rest of the deck. And the name of my YouTube channel is hidden in the backing. It was a custom back that I chose. So now these two decks were very near the top of my most work with tarot deck list of 2020. They were second to most used ex aequo, and this one is the Clover tarot, which has been one of my favorite tarot decks for years. So every year it gets a lot of use. So there is a lot of nudity in this deck, be warned. And I used it both for querents and for myself. I love this deck. I love the colors. I love the imagery. I love the style of art. I even like the cardstock. I love everything about this deck. I love the voice it has. It gives good readings, easy to read. It's easy to read. It's precise. It has a strong voice, but very friendly. No nonsense voice. always always warm. No nonsense, but always warm and always encouraging. So a long-time favorite of mine. And this one, the Moonchild tahoe, I was really surprised to find on the list. If I had answered out of the top of my head which were my most worked with tahoe decks of 2020, I would not have named this one. But the fact is I used the tracker, so I know that it has been used extensively, so extensively that it's second to most worked with. It's not in the first place, but it's in the second place. And this deck I did not use for myself. I used only for querents. I almost didn't get this Moonchild tarot deck. And the reason why I almost didn't get it is because I had the Starchild tarot, which from the same author, from the same artist. And the style of the Starchild tarot is very close to the Moonchild, and I have never used the Starchild tarot a lot. I use it and I like to have it because querents like it and querents choose it more often than not, but I never used the tarot, the Starchild tarot for myself. So when this one, the Moonchild, was released, I almost didn't get it because it was too close to the style of the Starchild, and I thought I was not going to get much use out of it. But I was surprised to see that I actually prefer the Moonchild to the Starchild. I prefer, I think it's easier to read with the Moonchild. It gives better reading, to me at least. And even though I have not used this deck for myself, only for querents, I've been enjoying this deck last year, and it was quite a surprise. I was not expecting to enjoy it that much, and an even bigger surprise that it arrives second place in the most used tarot decks of 2020. But there it is. And in first place, the one deck that I used the most in 2020 is the Anake Tarot. The Anake Tarot is very well known. The version I have is the indie version, published by the artist herself. But I know that this deck has been published mass market, and many people have this deck in the mass market edition. The cards are a little larger in the mass market version. But I like the indie version of the deck, and I really enjoy this deck. It's a very good little rider-waite style deck. Also, like the Clover tarot, it's the style of the illustrations are very different, but like the Clover tarot, I find that this deck is easy to read, and it has a very clear voice, a very clear and strong voice, and always very friendly and very encouraging and positive. Even though the Clover tarot and this one are very different in the style of the art, they give me similar vibes in the way they talk, in the voice they have, and it's a very easy to read little deck. And also last year in 2020, I used this deck, the Anake, exclusively for querent. I didn't use it for myself. I didn't read for myself with it, but it has been chosen by querent several times over the year, which is why it arrives in first place. So these were the 10 decks I used the most in 2020, and some of them really surprised me. I couldn't have given you the 10 names without this tracker. If I had answered out of the top of my head, I would have answered the Clover, the Spolia, and all the Baba decks, but I would have probably omitted the rest. And thanks to the tracker, I realized that some decks that I've used a lot really surprised me. I was surprised that the Moonchild tahoe was in the list. I was surprised that the Anna K was top of the list, and I was also surprised to find that I have used the Mermaid tahoe that much. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.